We spoke about the power of speech, how man was endowed with speech specifically for the purpose of development of his spirituality, his neshama. Because through speech, as the Gemara tells us, when one studies Torah, you have to verbalize, you have to articulate it based on the pasuk in Tehillim, where Bruria cited a pasuk. Bruria was the wife of Rameir. Chaim hi l'motzayim. When you study Torah, it brings life to those who are motzi bepeh, those who express it through their mouths. It's not just meditation. You have to verbalize it. Then you meditate after you verbalize it. So we had showed that regarding the balance of kedusha, good and evil, there always has to be a counterbalance. Esav was the counterbalance for Yaakov. Yaakov was good. Esav was evil. As it says, when Rivka was pregnant, we knew Rashi yet. There was agitation in the womb, and Rashi says to Chazal, whenever she would pass by beis of Shem and Ever, when passed by the beis of Shem and Ever, Yaakov would bolt to leave. Whenever they would pass by, she would pass by a temple of idolatry. Esav would bolt to leave. This was the pain she was experiencing. So that was, or another interpretation, they were actually warring and fighting over the two worlds, the spiritual world and the physical world. And who has the upper hand? So that's the balance of good and evil. So there's always, and Shlomo tells us in Koheles, there's always a counterbalance. Because if there's no counterbalance, then ultimately man will be influenced overwhelmingly to do one, not the other. And man is always in the equicenter point, and he has the ability to make a choice. That's the concept. So we had said that we find that the Torah says, why did Yitzhak love Esav? Kitzai befiv. So one of the interpretations, Rashi says, we'll see in a moment, Tzod of befiv. He deceived his father with his mouth. With his power of speech, he deceived his father. So we see that although the ultimate is achieved, a man was endowed with speech for the sake of Torah, which is the objective of creation. But on the other hand, the one who is the antithesis of that, the counterforce, he also uses the power of speech for the sake of deception. Even though Esav is al-Charbcha Tichya, he lives by the sword, but the reason why he's able to succeed to such a degree with his physical might is because he utilizes the power of speech and to be deceptive. That's what we were speaking about yesterday, and we went at length on this. Trapped father with the power of speech. If you look in the midrash, the midrash Tanchuma says, "Ve'yizokein Yitzhak." When he became old, he became blind, whether it was macular degeneration. It says, why did he become blind? Quotes a pasuk in Mishlei, Even Chen Hashochat, Be'inei Ba'olov El Kol Sheifnei Yaskil. Shochat is bribery. Bribery is the equivalent of a stone, which is attractive in the eyes of a person. Hashochad lama udome. What is it? Shochad, bribery. What is it equivalent of? Le'evin, to a stone. Chomokum shenofel shoveris. Wherever the stone falls, it smashes. Shochad smashes. It breaks. Person has clarity. It disrupts. Who's Shlomo Melton? Mishlei speaking about Proverbs. Medaber b'Yitzhak. Shenemar. Vayev Yitzhak es Esav ki tzayid b'fiv. Pasuk we just quoted. Yitzhak loved Esav because he had tzayid b'fiv. The trapping was in his mouth. Simply you read the story, the narrative, it's because Esav was the firstborn, that's why he loved him. But the Torah says no. The reason why he loved him was ki tzayid b'fiv. Because we'll see, he deceived him with his mouth. Mal ki tzayid b'fiv, or Yitzhak hatzadik b'fiv. He entrapped his father, the tzaddik, with his mouth. All the sins that God despises, he violated every one of those. Esav, and he quotes the pasuk. When Esav would return home after being out of the house, he would say to his father, he would say to his father, do you have to tithe salt? Of course, he knew you don't have to tithe it, but this was all to mislead his father, to show that he's devout. Even things that definitely, without a question, don't need tithing. He was father because of his carefulness not to violate. Maybe you have to tithe salt. And Yitzchak was taken aback when his Esau would ask him these questions, and he would say, just look at my son, look how meticulous he is when it comes to food mitzvahs. Then he would say to Esau, where were you? Where you coming from? We're coming from yeshiva. I was in the beis Talmud. I was studying. Lo kach halacha, mikach v'kach. And he said, isn't that the halacha? He would say to his father, is this the prohibition? Is this this permitted? When we talk, Dor Melo, and as a result of this kind of conversation, he entrapped his father with his mouth. He deceived him. Al Kain Ahevo, that's why he loved him. Ruach Kodesh Shaveches and Ruach HaKodesh simultaneously was whispering in his ear, Ki Yechanen Kolo Al Tamenbo, Ki Sheva Toevis Belibo. Meaning, under no circumstance should you give it any credibility, what he's saying. Okay? That's the midrash. And that's what Rashi cites. Only doesn't cite it fully, but he entrapped him with his mouth. Now, he didn't say he was deceptive, but the midrash says the power of speech. In what context did he deceive his father? Within the context of Torah. Kol Yaakov, the power of speech was endowed to Yaakov because he represents Torah, which is Kedusha. A man was endowed with that to develop his soul, because that's the way you bring the world and the objective to perfection, to have a relationship with Hashem. Esav uses that power of speech not to be conniving in a business deal only. Of course that he was, but in regard to his father, he used the power of speech within the context of Torah, which was totally deceptive. He presented himself as holier than thou at the most extreme level, but factually it was all guile, it was all deception. So we see that even when we talk about Zelu Mazeh, one counters the other. It's even within the context of Kedusha, they tried to corrupt the Kedusha. It's a corruption of the Kedusha. They use that characteristic. That's what we see from the midrash. That's the point they're making. So it's not only we're empowered, they're empowered, but even when they're empowered and they utilize what we have to corrupt it and bring about something which will undermine the good and to establish the evil. Okay, now the Medrash continues over here and says something interesting. Medrash quotes a pasuk that the nations of the world are always plotting to destroy us, and Hashem doesn't allow that. And somehow the plot is always foiled. And they recognize this, and they're amazed at it. Adrianus Omar Rabbi Yeshua. Adrianus was the Roman emperor. He says to Rabbi Yeshua, Gedola Kivsa Homedes Bein Shivim Zevim. Great is the sheep that's encircled with 70 wolves. The Jewish people are the scapegoat. Were surrounded with the 70 wolves. We should be devoured. So the question is, why are we devoured? Why are we destroyed? Omar lo. So the Roman emperor says to Rabbi Yeshua, Godel hu haroeh shematzilo v'shomra. V'shomra for now. So he said to him, look how compassionate These wolves are who encircle the scapegoat, the goat. Why aren't you destroyed? You should be devoured. It must be because of the benevolence of the nations of the world. That's why you're not destroyed. That clearly projects who we are. We're compassionate, we're kind, we're giving. So Rabbi Shua answers him, Amalo Rabbi Shua, Gedola Kivso Medesbei, Amalo Godlo Huaroa Shabatzilo, Vishomra Vishomrim for now. He says, no, it's not that you're so benevolent. We have a shepherd who's powerful and he watches over us that we should not be destroyed. He said it's us, and Rabbi Shua says, no, it's not you, it's the shepherd that's been watching over us. And that's the reason why we're not destroyed. And that's, he quotes the pasuk in Mishlei, Koklei Yotzer Alayich Lo Yitzloch. Whatever machinations they have and plottings they have, they will not succeed. Why? Because our shepherd watches over us. And I always mention there's a siddur called Rav Yaakov and Esav siddur. In the introduction, he writes that although we no longer live in an era of revealed miracles, there's one revealed miracle which is continuous, which cannot be denied. No nation in the history of this world has ever gone through what the Jewish people have gone through. Holocaust, enslavement, grums, displacements. And we're still here, and all the nations that tried to destroy us are no longer here. They all went into the dustbins of history. That itself is a statement. That's a revealed miracle. How's it possible? It defies every odds. There's no such thing. The answer is because we have that shepherd that's watching over us. And that's exactly what Yeshua has nothing to do with the compassion of the people. The people who try to destroy always went to the wayside. And we always came out on top, always. We have our pits, we have the valleys very deep, but ultimately we rise. That's the history of the Jewish people. So I was thinking, every human being has a conscience. And you have to live with your conscience. Somebody who tries to destroy us in the most cruel way, the Romans were cruel beyond imagining what cruelty was. So how did they live with themselves? He'd say they were barbarians, but they had intellect, they had wisdom, they had culture, they had everything. How did they? You could say they could have been rabid hate. They were like on an unstable level when it came to hate of anti-Semitism. That's what they were. But simultaneously, see from here that because they don't succeed, that somehow that addresses the conscience. He's saying to Rabbi Yeshua, look how kind, look how benevolent we are. How does the sheep, the goat survive 70 wolves? How are we not devoured? There's only one answer. It must be because there's a streak of compassion within us, and we don't cross that line to bring about total annihilation. That's the only reason. This is what the Roman Emperor is. What does he have to say it? Who cares what the Jew thinks? Because this is even the anti-Semite has to live with his conscience, and this is the way he's able to deal with his conscience. That we're compassionate. Rabbi Shua says it has nothing to do with your compassion. It has to do with the shepherd that's watching over us. But you have to recognize who you are and to deal with your issues. To tell us that Hitler was killed, he was killed with a sword. So Rashi immediately cites the midrash. Why is it important for us to know that he was killed with the sword? He was killed with an arrow. He died of a heart attack. Well, it's irrelevant. So Rashi cites the Chazal, the midrash, that initially, when they tried to figure out why the Jews are so successful, they said their leader, his power lies in his mouth. So they believed he has the power to curse, with power to bless. So they said, we have to find someone who's going to counter that. Whose power lies in his mouth? Bilam. So Bilam chose the power of speech, which is the characteristic of the Jewish people, which is not his, because his characteristic is Achar Chotichya. The nations of the world live by the sword. The physical people. Speech, as we discussed yesterday, is a spiritual characteristic. The nations of the world are physical. They have no elements of spirituality. The essence of the Jew is his soul. The body is only to facilitate the objective of the soul. Speech is a derivative of the soul to bring that about. The non-Jew who is physical, speech is not his, that's not his characteristic. Is you live by the soul, that's physical mind, that's power. So he went and embezzled that characteristic from us. So as he took our characteristic to destroy us, we took his characteristic, his profile, which is the sword. That's what the Torah says. Therefore, the Torah says he was killed by the sword for that reason. Our classification is Odom. We discussed the name in Maral. Odom means, just as earth, what it is, it represents potential. If you leave it fallow, it's just a clump of earth. But if you cultivate it, all life grows out of earth. That is the essence of a Jew. If you utilize and you invest your life and you take control over the animal and you rein in on the animal, which is the physicality, and you use the body to bring about Kedusha, then you advance the neshama. And that's what the Maral says. There's no positive commandments among the 7 Noahide laws, except for establishing the judicial system. The concept of aseh, do, is always advancement. Lo taseh is don't do, that's diminishment. Don't cross the line because you're going to be diminished. Do, it's in your best interest to do because you can advance yourself. The 7 Noahide laws, every one is negative, except for mishpatim, to establish a judicial system, because that's only to ensure that they don't violate the negative. But it's not positive, independent of the negative. We have tefillin, tzitzis, matzah, sukkah, whatever it is. The study of Torah, these are all advancement. Because we have the characteristic of Adama. That's Adam, Atem Kriyim Adam. But all that is connected to our essence, which is our neshama, our spirituality. The Jewish people are a spiritual people. As the Maral says, the 70 nations, the Jewish people are the 71st nation. We surpass 7 is natural. That's the natural order. The Jew is the supernatural order. We surpass, we transcend the 7. So the essence of the Jew is what? Is his neshama. The physical is only to facilitate the neshama, to facilitate the objective of the neshama. Speech, as we discussed, is a direct derivative of the soul. When Hashem infused Adam with the soul, it says he became a speaking species. So there we showed that speech is a direct outgrowth of the neshama. That's not the non-Jew. So when you say Bilam took our characteristic of speech, which is directly connected to our essence, which is our neshama, has no relevance to the non-Jews, it was considered an embezzlement. How do you take the profile of the Jew and utilize it to try to destroy them? And that's really what Esav was. Esav takes Sayed Nefiv, he's utilizing that characteristic of the speech and present himself as if he's Yaakov, as if he's this holier than thou type person. And we showed from the midrash, it's not only deceptive in worldly matters, it's even within spirituality, he's deceptive. There was a story, trying to remember his name for a second. He was the head of the church in France. And there was a whole ruckus about 25, he's not alive any longer. And he was invited to come to Yeshiva University. And it was they were studying during the Talmud session. And he walks in with his vestments. You hear this? His Catholic vestments. Walks into the beis midrash. His red.
Cardinal Lustiger.
Cardinal Lustiger. And he looks over the shoulders of the students, sees that study Gemara, and he makes comments, and somebody's accompanying him. Could you imagine? You bring in the devil into the beis hamikdash over there. And he says to some of the students, group, he says, that on the yard side of his mother, he says Kaddish. He observes the yard side of his mother. This is what he tells the students. And he engages in a conversation. And they should not speak to this guy. And one of the main personalities of Yeshiva University is accompanying him. And he's glowing. His students, he's priding himself, the students with the Cardinal Lustiger. After this incident took place, there was a rebellion against the person who brought them in. And they said, unacceptable. How do you bring such a man into a beis midrash? How do you allow me to speak to the students? Do you understand the level of effect this man can have on people, what he represents? As a result of this, there were a number of people who had tenure in Yeshiva University. They lost their tenure and they left Yeshiva University. They were forced to leave. They left. And they were given the ultimatum that either you retract your protest or you're out of here. You lose your tenure, and once you lose your tenure, there's no point in staying. People there already were like 30 years. And a number of them said, we're not retracting, and they left. That's the story. This is Esav saying to his father, how do you tithe salt? How do you tithe straw? Using the power of speech as what? As a deceptive tactic to try to undermine what Kedusha is all about. So it's not only using it to be the counterbalance within worldly affairs, even within spiritual affairs, they use the power of speech as what? As the counterbalance. Everybody knows. Ner mitzvah Torah or. What does Torah mean? It's an illumination. You know, it says both in chametz lo ner. When you search for chametz, the 14th of Nisan, you have to use a single wick candle. Why? You can't use a torch because a candle doesn't cast a shadow. And since you have to search out the nooks and crannies where the chametz is, you will illuminate those locations that you'll identify the chametz. Ner mitzvah Torah or. The only reason why there's gray is only because there's lack of illumination. Once you have that clarity, there's no such thing as gray. There's black and white. And when you see the black, you stay away from the black. Therefore, there's no such thing as cold by Esav. If our illumination is not in place, we see evil as good and good as evil. That's what happens. The Rambam cites the pasuk by the Novi when he's speaking and giving Musa to Klausen for the destruction of the first beis Hamikdash. Omrim ala or choshech al choshech or. They say light is darkness and darkness is light. They were everything was totally distorted. Why was it distorted? Because of the way they lived their lives. The 3 cardinal sins. They didn't study Torah. That's the reason. As a result of that, the beis Hamikdash was destroyed. It was a lack of clarity. I mean, everything became attractive because we didn't have sufficient illumination. But if you have the illumination, doesn't mean just mental, it's internal. You internalize the truth. When you have an internalization of truth, it's not a problem. The example I always give, the person is honest, lives a life of honesty, integrity, above reproach. And somebody comes with him with a deal which is dishonest, and he can make a lot of money. Because the essence of a person is honesty, there's no way you could tempt this person to get involved. Because he appreciates what it means to be honest, and he sees dishonesty in the most negative light. He doesn't want to go near it. Another person who believes in honesty and truth, but he hasn't internalized it, he can be tempted. You know, every man has his price. Because he hasn't sufficiently internalized truth and honesty. When we study Torah sufficiently and we actualize the mitzvahs, it becomes part and parcel of our emotion, our mind, and everything. Then you have illumination. There's no basis for temptation. The temptation is reduced to a very minimal level. But if not, darkness starts taking on the characteristics of light. It's attractive. And light, because it infringes on our desires, it becomes something we're opposed to it. It ruffles our feathers. Therefore, darkness becomes light becomes darkness for that reason. Celebrate Hanukkah. What was the story of Hanukkah? The Greeks imposed their culture on us. They wanted us to assume their beliefs, their culture. And many Jews, a very significant number of Jews, they Hellenized. And they participated in the Olympics. And Jews who were circumcised, they did a procedure that they should appear to be uncircumcised. Because when they would perform in the Olympics, they performed naked because they worshiped the beauty of the body. So if the body was damaged and mutilated, it was a desecration. It's the desecration of nature, and they worship nature. So Jews, it's called Moshe Orloso. There's a procedure that they're able to pull the foreskin. The halachically person circumcised, once he's circumcised, but they pulled the foreskin, weighted it down, that eventually it covered the male organ, unnaturally. They were Hellenized. What happened with the Chashmonoim? The family of the Kohanim, the Zealots, it reached a point they would not tolerate it anymore. But a good number of Jews, I don't know if it's the majority, they Hellenized. How do you Hellenize? I mean, here we're talking, we have a beis midrash. And the first beis midrash, there were miracles in the beis midrash. There was prophets during the first temple period. With all that, they were Hellenized. And the Gemara tells us why. Because Torah is over. Because when they studied the Torah, they didn't study it to actualize the mitzvahs, but rather as an intellectual pursuit. When you study it, involved for intellectualism, but it's not a way of life. It doesn't impact on you, that it changes your emotion, your mind, and changes your essence. As a result of that, they Hellenized. The Chashmonoim, they put the brake on it. When they brought a pig on the altar in the beis midrash, that was the breaking point. They said, we cannot tolerate it any longer. It was such an extreme level of desecration. And that was the beginning of the war against the Greeks. And miraculously, because they were willing to die for Kiddush Hashem, they merited miracles that they were able to overthrow the Greeks and drive them out of the land and reestablish the Kedusha of the beis midrash for that reason. But how can it happen? It doesn't take much time to change. Person lives in New York with an environment. Then you go to the Far East to work for a corporation where there's no support system. It doesn't take long before it starts evaporating and dissipating. And all of a sudden you assume certain behavior patterns. You have certain social circles. And then you see things differently. And you become vulnerable to many things that you would have never dreamed that you were vulnerable when you lived within a community where you had all these support systems for your Judaism. The children were agitating within her innards, the Tomer, and came Lomazochi, the Hashem. So we'll see, Rash, why did I pray to become pregnant? So she went to seek out some kind of reading, some clarity on what's going on. Rashi, Visrotu, Al Korcho Hamikra Zeomed Darsheni. The Pasuk says this has to be interpreted. It's not simple. What's this agitation? Shesosa Mahi Ritzitzuzu. What is all this? V'kosa became Lomazadochi. She says she's regretting that she became pregnant. Sendo Shul Shabitza. Yisod comes the word of running, bolting. So there is a piste Torah Shel Shem and Ever. When she would pass by the entrance of the yeshiva of Shem and Ever, Yaakov Rotz Mefarchis Lotzes. Yaakov would actually run and bolt to go out. Oversa piste Avodazora, when she would pass by the entrance of a temple of idolatry, Esav Mefarchis Lotzes. Okay, so there's a question which is asked. The Gemara tells us in Sanhedrin, then when does the Yetzer Hara come upon a child that he should be inclined to go in that south direction when he's born? But in utero, it's not the case. Correct? So if that's the case, here we find in utero that Esav is already attracted to idolatry. He's bolting to get out. So you see, this is not the case. they say something which is a little humorous. The Gemara tells us that when a child is in the womb of his mother, he has a malach teaching him the Torah in entirety. So if Yaakov has a malach teaching him Torah, why is he running out? Yeah, Alan, this fits your question, addresses your question. You have a malach and you have Shem and Ever. You stay with the malach. You know what the answer is? When you have the malach and you have Esav right next to you, even with the malach, it's not going to help you because the Esav is going to undermine whatever the influence that angel could be. Therefore, he's running out, he's bolting out to go to Shem and Ever, which is pure Torah itself. Because if you have that negative influence simultaneously, it doesn't happen, it doesn't work. That Esav was already inclined to negative, to evil, even before he was born. So how do we understand it? Now, the Gemara tells us at the end of Shabbos what happened at Sinai. Because we were exposed to Hashem's presence at this one-of-a-kind of level, the impurity of what happened with the snake, with the serpent, and the Eitz Hadas, that impurity was minimized. And because it was minimized, therefore we have the ability of discernment, which the non-Jew doesn't have. The non-Jew doesn't have the control over his essence the way a Jew has. You can only give a person a choice if it's within his ability to make the choice. Because of what happened at Sinai, and we were there at that level, that defective gene was expunged from us. Therefore, we're at a level, on a pedestal, we can make choices. The non-Jew cannot make those choices. Therefore, the non-Jew is limited only to the 7 Noahide laws, which are basic laws, which aren't that complicated. Because even our laws are much more complicated because there are subcategories of every one of those laws. It's not only, you're not permitted to commit murder. What about if a person undermines another person's livelihood? The Gemara says that's the equivalent of committing murder. If you embarrass another person to the point where he changes colors a number of times, that's called bizraya l'ritzicha. It's a semblance of taking that person's life. And a Jew has liability and culpability. All this has no reference to a non-Jew. There's certain sensitivities, which has to do with our senses, to see truth from non-truth. That's only the person. You can't demand the person who's blind to see when he doesn't have the ability to see. The Jew has abilities, has senses, which a non-Jew does not have. So therefore, even though we have these acute senses, where the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination comes upon us, that we should incline to make it into a struggle. Esav himself does not represent that. Esav himself, he has choice, but his choice is a different choice than Yaakov's choice. Therefore, when they passed over a temple of idolatry, he bolted to get out, because that was his essence. Did he have the ability to overcome that? Yes, but that was not his essence. Yaakov's essence was Kedusha. Despite that, when he was born, now he has an evil inclination, distracting him to cause him to be inclined to go in the other direction, that's his challenge. That's the way I understand this. People born circumcised. Who is born circumcised? Yaakov, being the most special of the patriarchs, was born without a foreskin. Without a foreskin. Esav was never circumcised. He was born with a foreskin. He was never circumcised, Esav. Why wasn't he circumcised initially? Because when he was born, he had a reddish hue to him. And the Gemara tells us that before the blood is absorbed in the corpuscles or properly, and the liver is working right, the child could bleed to death. So Yitzchak initially thought that he's not sufficiently healthy to have him circumcised. And he put it off and put it off and put it off till he became an adult, because then he realized This red hue, that's Esav is red. And once he was an adult, Esav said to him, I don't want to be circumcised. So Esav was never circumcised. Yaakov was born without a foreskin. As we discussed many times, what does this foreskin represent? That's an expression of Deitzadas, the evil of Deitzadas. Yosef was born without a foreskin. Moshe Rabbeinu was born without a foreskin. David HaMelech was born without a foreskin. This is all confirmation that the essence of these people were not affected by the Eitz Hadas to the same degree as all humanity. Therefore, their potential and their capacity was a different capacity. Yaakov, Yosef, David, Moshe Rabbeinu.